All right, I'm here with Chris Nowinski, and we've actually figured out our technology and got everything working and ready to go. It's great to have you back. I was checking to see the last time you were on. It was back in 2014, if you can believe it. So there's been quite a lot of updated, technology and information and all that sort of stuff. But let's just jump in, Chris. I mean, obviously, you have done so much for concussion research and getting a lot of results and that sort of thing. So how much has changed in the last 10 years and how many advancements have you made?
Yeah, I guess the story for the last 10 years is that I think we've basically gotten concussions into the public consciousness, and I think the protocols are better, rehabilitation's better, and there's not a whole lot farther to go in terms of recognizing them and taking care of them. I think the big change over the last 10 years has been the recognition that CTE is a much bigger issue than we wanted it to be. Because when we first connected on this, back in 2007, when we lost our mutual friend, we could get into if you'd like to, it was, we still didn't even know how to diagnose CTE in living people, like with an agreed upon criteria that had just been government endorsed. That happened in 2015 when the first NDS CT criteria was published using our brain bank at Boston University. Now we've also proven that at that point the NFL was still denying that their game caused CTE, we've now convinced the National Institutes of Health of causation, so that while FIFA, World Rugby, and the NHL still refuse to acknowledge it, the scientists acknowledge causation. And I think we're getting very close to diagnosing it in living people. But the problem has been we've now studied 400 some NFL players, and 93% of them have had it. We've studied on nearly 24 NHL players, and 95% of them have had it. And so and we've shown this very clear dose response relationship, meaning it's like smoking and lung cancer. The earlier you start, the longer you do it, the more your risk. And that's been now proven in multiple sports.
Well, let's take a step back here. So you're talking about our mutual friend, of course, talking about Chris Benoit. And we all know the issues and the tragedy that happened with him. But the thing that was pointed out at the time, like you mentioned back in 2007, was CTE. And here we are, hard to believe, almost 20 years later. Now that's kind of part of the vernacular in sports medicine. But at the time, it wasn't. So let's talk about what exactly is CTE. And like you mentioned, the advancement over the last 15 years or so in just getting the word out there and what it actually is.
Yeah. So CTE is what we used to call punch drunk, because it was first seen in
really?
boxers. Yeah. Oh. So it was 100 years ago, 1928, that a doctor named Harrison Martland wrote a very sentinel article in the Journal of the American Medical Association about how he's noticing all these boxers that are coming in all messed up in middle age and older. And really, it was sort of put the pieces together. And so when we studied Chris Benoit, there were only 45 cases that had ever been published in the world's literature. So it was still, people didn't really understand it. So looking back at that, I sort of understand why people were pushing back, because it was such a rare disease. It was sort of like we knew punch drunk was a thing. I actually, in my lectures, show a comedian named Red Skelton on TV in the 1950s with a character named Cauliflower McPug, who was a punch drunk boxer. It didn't make sense, and everyone would laugh at it.
Yeah, it was a comedy thing, right?
Yeah, we all knew it, but we never did the science to really understand it. And so basically what happens is you get shots to the head usually while you're young in sports, sometimes military service as a teenager, your 20s, and it's the rapid usually rotation of your brain will cause small lesions to form because the tissue gets stretched and strained, and small areas around blood vessels, because of shearing forces. Basically, your blood vessels are a little harder than your brain tissue, and so you twist them and you're going to get an injury, and you get breakdown of the blood-brain barrier and all this bad stuff happening on a tiny microscopic level. And you get these lesions that we don't know if they ever repair because we can't diagnose living people, but we see them now as young as 17. I think there's been a 15-year-old reported, and then even after you stop getting hit in the head, for some reason, these lesions spread like a crack in a windshield.
Oh,
And so essentially we start seeing odd behaviors. It's hard to distinguish in young people whether those odd behaviors are due to the CTE or due to all the brain injuries you have to get CTE. But then in midlife, older life, you've lost so many neurons that you actually start changing. So everyone sort of reports personality change is the big thing. But you in older people, you start getting cognitive problems, executive dysfunction issues. You start making bad decisions, usually having poor judgment, not being able to follow through with tasks. Eventually, your memory goes. And then we also see neurobehavioral dysregulation, aggression, violence, gambling, alcoholism, like all these things we think are somewhat related to the fact that your brain is falling apart.
But it's interesting because, I was always think back to like the first person that, I don't know, ever had cancer, and it's like, you're losing a lot of weight and you're throwing up. What's wrong with you, man? And of course, now we know exactly what it is, how to treat it. Has CTE moved down the line that way to now you can diagnose it earlier in a living person before they do something as extreme as what Chris did? And can you even start to even try and treat it at this point in time?
So people are starting to wake up to the reality. So like, when, I would say 10 years ago, I didn't have many people reaching out, asking for help. Like I think my problems are due to hits to the head. Now I have 5 full-time people who are just taking inbound requests of, I need help. I played 20 years of football. I was a pro wrestler, whatever it was. And I think my problems are related to that, or my husband's problems are related to that. What can we do? We do treat the symptoms like aggressively, and have the doctors we work with have good success midlife. The problem is we can't actually be sure you have CTE, right? So we're just going to treat the symptoms, the behavioral symptoms. We're going to treat the memory symptoms. We're going to talk about all the other things that could be causing it that may not be CTE. A lot of people have sleep disorders that are untreated, and that can make you feel foggy. People have substance abuse disorders that if you unwind it, they start doing better. So, obesity, pain issues, all those things can sort of wrap into that. So we can't, but we don't have a biomarker. The scientific term is a biomarker, like a scan for cancer or a blood test for cancer. We don't have that for CT. We're getting there. We have a lot of the studies that are trending there, using PET scans, using blood markers, but we haven't done the work. Until we started the center at Boston University in 2008, there was no academic center ever focused on this disease in the world. And so we're chasing the Alzheimer's research model, but we have a lot of catching up to do to get us there.
So even though you can see CTE on a brain from a cadaver, shall we say, someone passes away, you get their brain and study it, which is what you did with Chris's brain and many others. You can see the CTE in the brain when you look at it, but you can't see it in a scan?
Correct. We only recently learned how to see the protein. It's called tau protein. It's become hyperphosphorylated, misfolded. We've started being able to image it in the last decade in Alzheimer's disease. And what we've learned is that the Alzheimer's disease tracers, they're called, don't work for CT. And it wasn't until 2019 that somebody actually proved using cryo-electron microscopes, like the best microscopes we have, that the misfolding of the protein is slightly different from Alzheimer's to CT. And so that's why we think doesn't bind. The tracer, the radioactive compounds don't bind. But we now finally have some doctors that are trying to build that from the ground up because they realize that this is out there, and it's something that we can probably solve.
All right, let me ask you something. How much of your personal info is floating around out there on the internet? Your phone number, your home address, maybe even your family members' names. Stuff's valuable and not in a good way. That's why I use Delete Me. Delete Me makes it easy, quick, and safe to remove your personal data online at a time when surveillance and data breaches are out of control. As someone with a public profile and a podcast that goes around the world, I take my privacy very seriously. I don't want that personal info being sold by data brokers I've never even heard of. And with Delete Me, I don't have to worry. Their team does all the hard work of scrubbing your info from hundreds of data broker websites. You just tell them what to delete and they get to work. So it's not just a one and done thing. They keep monitoring and removing your info 24/7. And every few weeks, you get a personalized report showing what they found and got rid of. Take control of your data and keep your private life private by signing up for Delete Me. Now at a special discount for our listeners. Right now, you can get 20% off your plan. Just text Jericho to 64000. That's Jericho to 64,000 for 20% off. Message and data rates may apply. Jericho to 64000. Protect yourself and your family because no one else is going to do it for you. So going back to, obviously the Chris's case is the one that I know the best, taking the personal relationship at it. So CTE could cause you to turn into a homicidal maniac?
That's a great question.
Hard to say that.
Well, I mean, there's two answers to the question. One is that you can't, say that disease caused that single act, right? Because it's just like there's so many other variables involved. That being said, I think we have, maybe we're getting close to like 10 murders in the brain bank who all have sort of the same story. That they were fine, and then they started having some mental health problems, and then they started, and then they went off and killed people. Philip Adams is a very good example of that. He was a early 30s NFL player who was starting to have some real problems. We often see like paranoid schizophrenic stuff. And I remember when he went down the road with a gun and killed 6 strangers, including 2 children and their grandparents and 2 workers on this property.
Oh my gosh.
And he had stage 2 CT and frontal lobe atrophy in his early 30s. Police, he went back to his house, ended up killing himself. The FBI was brought in to try to make sense of the books he'd written, like book after book after book of notes and thoughts. And they just said, no, he just lost his mind. Like they made no sense. There was no political act here. He just lost his mind. So if I think about, some of these cases are known, some of them are unknown. I just coordinated the brain donation of another murder suicide last week, where when I spoke to the police about it, they already suspected CT. Like every time we've seen this sort of midlife lose your mind thing, and we've looked, I think we almost every time we've seen CT. We just studied the brain of the Maine shooter who killed 18 people in Lewiston, Maine, who was a military veteran who trained on grenades. He didn't actually have CTE. He had evidence of traumatic brain injury. So you don't always, it's brain injury. Even with Chris, we don't know if it was multiple concussions over and over again. And the pathologies, there's basically like a dozen pathologies that come from that, different changes in your brain. CT is one of them. So you hit somebody in the head enough, you're going to get odd behaviors, antisocial behaviors, violence. Like that's sort of a known thing. So yes, I do believe that, knowing Chris for 5 years, that had his brain not been degenerating, plus he'd had probably some recent concussions, without that, I don't think this happens. And my problem is in my world, I could just keep seeing that play out over and over again. Even Saturday morning, I'm walking a 5K with about 10 families who'd lost people to CTE. And afterwards, we all get together for breakfast and in a ballroom, and they're all like sharing their stories. And I just can't believe how many involve violence. These people, they end up not killing their families, but a lot of the spouses woke up with guns in their faces. And these just weird behaviors.
Could this also cause like Parkinson's? And the reason why I asked, I'm working on a show right now about Muhammad Ali in his early years. And obviously we know that Ali, one of the greatest of all time, ends up with very severe Parkinson's. Dean Malenko's gone on the record as having Parkinson's. It's not a secret. Is it something that could be caused by constant pounding to the brain and to the head?
Yes. So we just published last year that, Parkinson's is about a quarter of the people that we've diagnosed with CT have had features of Parkinsonism. When we looked at their brains, 3 out of 4 did not have classic Parkinson's disease. They just had CTE that really involved the motor cortex. So basically, if you're talking about somebody you suspect to have CT, so a football player, a boxer, I would say you can extrapolate from that study is probably more likely than not, they don't have classic Parkinson's, but it was caused by the hits to the head.
It's amazing how you have become kind of the expert on all this, and it just popped in my head because the gimmick when you were wrestling was that you were Chris Harvard and smarter than the average bear. And, the fiction becomes truth, where you then end up becoming smarter than the average bear because of what happened to you with your concussion issues.
Yeah. Well, it was, part of it was never a gimmick. The only part of the gimmick was that I was a jerk. And that's debated, but yeah, I know. I mean, it's true. I mean, I really, I do miss my time. I loved it. Part of the reason I loved wrestling is it was like such a challenge, like to, try to get in the ring with guys like you and perform at your level. I mean, I still think it's just fascinating, just the idea of these live stunt performances with a real audience that change on the fly, and it's fascinating. But I mean, unfortunately, I couldn't do it anymore, and this is the next challenge, and I'm just I'm excited to commit my life to it. And it is wild to think, like, we're in 20 years later, like how far we've come.
Well, and we'll continue to talk about that. Let's go from, once again, you start out trying to spread awareness about this. The Benoit thing happens in 2007. You continue to move forward. I remember, just like my father in Manitoba in Canada started Special Olympics in Canada. And when he first started talking about Special Olympics, a lot of people were like, no way, no access, get the hell out of here. This isn't even a thing. Did you face the same thing when you first started? And how did you first start breaking out into this whole, concussion legacy, the foundation, and just becoming the guy when it comes to athletic concussions? Did you face a lot of resistance at first? Because it seems like you still face a lot of resistance now as well.
Yeah, I do. Now when we face resistance, it's just like you realize you're just fighting that big tobacco fight again. And it just gets, they're going to fight forever because there's money on the line. At the beginning, I would say there was a little more room for debate because we didn't have all this really strong science. But yeah, I mean, if you remember, like, everybody said we were nuts, that this wasn't, I remember going to the NFL headquarters in 2008 for like the first time we ever met with them face to face on this issue, and their doctors were asking like the most basic questions, like, aren't you just misdiagnosing Alzheimer's, and all these like really insulting questions to these doctors. Right. And so there was a real lack of knowledge. So the NFL said we were nuts. WWE at the time did not accept the findings on Benoit in any meaningful way.
Really? So they wouldn't acknowledge those findings with Chris?
No, I mean, in the early days, I think that, if we go back to read the articles, they were saying we don't agree with the diagnosis, we don't agree with a whole lot of other different things. Basically, how this all came about is that when I got hurt in 2003, and WWE was sending me to a lot of doctors to try to get me back together, because of course they wanted me back to work. I wanted to be back to work. They were trying to get me the best people, and I ended up at a guy named Dr. Robert Cantu's office, and he was the first guy to help me understand that part of the reason he helped me understand I had concussions was because he said, well, how many concussions you had before this one? I said, I've never been diagnosed with a concussion, which was actually sort of true at the time. Even that last one, the doctors would be like, maybe, because I wasn't knocked out. And he said, well, how many times you get hit in the head and you forgot where you were? You had double vision, you had saw stars, you had ringing in your ears, you lost your balance, you're falling over. And I was like, that happens a lot. And he's like, okay, well, those are concussions. And if you never called them that, you never reported them, you never took time off. If you get too many in a close period of time and you don't rest, let your brain recover, you can get into this situation where the symptoms become chronic. And and we call it post-concussion syndrome. And I was just sort of shocked. I was bothered by the idea that I was that ignorant, that every time I was getting hit in the head and the sky would go orange in football, or I would forget something going on in the match because I got hit so hard, that I didn't realize that was a serious injury. And so this all began as an idea of like, all right, well, I'm going to teach the world about concussions because I ruined my career being ignorant about them. And as I dug into that, I realized that the NFL was orchestrating a pretty, big, as I've said many times, a big tobacco-like cover-up of the whole thing.
Hmm.
on the concussion issue. But I also got hurt when the first two CT cases were published in medical literature by Benedict Malu, who from the Concussion movie. And so I interviewed him for the book. I wrote a book called Head Games Football's Concussion Crisis, laying out, here's a problem. The NFL's covering it up. We should do better. And I thought I was done. But the problem was like, no one really, a book doesn't change the world. You actually have to go do the work. And I got frustrated when Andre Waters, in November 2006, the guy I grew up watching, an NFL player, killed himself. And everyone was just like, pretend like it was, he missed the spotlight. And I was like, he was a guy who hit with his head all the time. So I coordinated his brain donation. I called the medical examiner and I said, are you going to study him for CT? And we had this long back and forth. And eventually he said, I don't do that, but if you find a doctor who can, I will let you know I retained part of his brain and you can have it, but you have to get his mother's permission. And I was like, what? Like, this whole idea of like calling a guy's mother who she just buried 2 weeks ago and didn't realize his brain might still be parts of it were kept by the medical examiner. It just was an overwhelming thought. But I literally asked the doctors I worked with, like, all right, can you call her to get permission? And none of them would do it. Like that was like, if I always go back, like that was a weird moment, because had somebody else called, that would have become my gimmick. But my gimmick became calling the families because no one else was sort of willing to. And so Andre was the first case who had it. I wanted to make sure people heard about it. So I actually took the findings to the New York Times and convinced them to make it a front page article. And that's when the pushback started, because it became sort of the NFL, the Times put it out the Friday before the Super Bowl, raising this discussion of, three NFL players have been diagnosed with this boxer's disease. Is that a thing? And the NFL didn't want to deal with it. So they said, this is crazy. And I realized that concussions had remained under the radar because they're invisible, right? When we got them, you might see some brief symptoms, but then after that, we just never see it again. And unless you say something, you never talk about it again. But CT was something you could see. When you put antibodies on the tissue and it turns this ugly brown, what you have. And so I said, all right, we're just going to get more brains and we'll win. Like basically we'll out-science them by getting more cases. And so I just, that's why I realized I didn't start the foundation, was to actually make sure that when I talked to families, they knew that no one was profiting from their loved one's brain. And then wanted to start partner with a medical school, and that became Boston University, because I realized that the NFL could always beat up on me, but a medical school would be able to fight back. And then we just went for it, and it just became this like 20-year war. But we now have 1,600 brains, and it includes, like, we have gotten a shockingly high percent of NFL players who've died, and that's going to give us some real insights into what's happening in football, which really leads the CT problem in the U.S. But internationally, hockey, soccer, rugby are going to dwarf football with the problems they have.
All right. There are times in our lives when you just need to talk to someone, but the process of finding a therapist can be very, very overwhelming. Between the long wait lists, confusing insurance stuff, and not knowing who'd actually be a good fit, it's just easy to want to give up. That's why I really appreciate what Rula is doing. Rula makes it so much easier to get the help that you need. They connect you with licensed in-network therapists, and most people pay as little as $15 per session. Wow. That's therapy that's actually affordable. They have over 15,000 vetted providers across more than 100 specialties, and they'll match you based on your needs, whether it's anxiety, depression, life transitions, or even medication management. And the best part, you could be talking to someone in as little as 24 hours. So join the thousands who've already turned to Rula for support on their journey to better mental health and well-being. Getting started is easy. Just visit rula.com/Jericho today. When you sign up, they'll ask you how you heard about them. So please support our show by letting them know that we sent you, that Jericho sent you. It's a simple way to help us while you take the first step towards the care you deserve. Go to rula.com/Jericho. That's RULA, rula.com/Jericho now, and connect with a licensed therapist who truly cares. Your mental health matters. Please visit rula.com/Jericho. It's interesting to me because you're talking about this pushback. It's almost like, you're orchestrating, opening up a government conspiracy, like, 9/11 or something. I'm sure they were coming out. Did they ever come after you and say, hey, man, this is, the men in black, stop it now sort of thing.
Yeah. And people always say that. People are like scared. Like, aren't you worried about your safety? And I was like, well, no, no, I mean, I guess I never was. And I'm actually surprised they never really tried to intimidate me. They never, no one ever chased, was following me. I think part of it was like at those levels, like people, there's been a lot there, but there were a lot of people in the early days who would quietly let me know, and they saw me in public, who worked at the NFL, like, thanks for what you're doing, because they don't think they were comfortable with what was happening. They knew guys were messed up. Like, it was this hidden problem that if you go to the Hall of Fame, like, everybody's not making sense, right? And so I think people wanted, like, there are a lot of people who wanted to see this get exposed. They also, I mean, they tried to squash us to the media. Right now you could never get a documentary about CT on television because the NFL gives games to every network. And so, Apple and Netflix, everybody gets a game.
Amazon,
so the NFL has the power to call them and say, you can't run a CT documentary about the, so like, that's a fact. Like, it's really hard to talk about this now. But it's never been so much as that I think my phone's tapped or anything.
Do you think that it could have something to do? I'm just thinking about the recent passing of Steve McMichael, Mongo McMichael, another total warrior who had really bad ALS. Is that something that can be caused perchance by concussions?
Yeah. So I was actually at the funeral services.
Oh, okay.
On Thursday. Yeah. Ric Flair was there. Along with a bunch of the 85 Bears. It was a private funeral, but because Mongo had decided to donate his brain while he was still alive to us.
No kidding. Wow. I didn't know that. Okay.
Yeah. He was following our work. And we have published in 2009, we published that some of the first ALS cases we got did not look like normal ALS. Because Dr. Ann McKee, who runs this brain bank, the genius that I've put my weight behind, she runs the National Veterans Administration ALS Brain Bank. So she sees all these veteran ALS cases, and the NFL cases didn't look like that. They were CT cases that seemed to be worse around the spinal column and some other important areas that might trigger this. So there's basically some relationship between CT and ALS. ALS is sort of what you call it when you can't move, when your motor neurons are dying, but there's probably dozens of ways to get there, right? It could be toxic exposures, it could be genetics, it could be trauma. And now that we've gone and looked at the populations, it's now been shown that NFL players are basically 4 times more likely. We published this, Dr. Dan Dantrout at Harvard led it, 4 times more likely to die of ALS if you played in the NFL. And we've seen it in soccer and we've seen it in other sports. So basically you have a lifetime of getting hit in the head.
Wow.
Your rates are about, 3 to 5 times. And so that can assume, like, some people get it normally and the rest of them are getting it because they're hitting the head over and over again. And I would assume that Mongo is part of that. It was caused by trauma.
So how did you start getting, because you said now you work with the NFL, right? They're one of the organizations that is working with you.
No, I don't have any. We don't have any formal relationship with the NFL.
Okay, so who is? Because you said that NHL is denying it, but what did the NFL?
The NFL. Well, so the NFL just sort of in 2016 at a congressional hearing admitted that they think there's a relationship.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think it was meant to be on purpose, but it was sort of like they answered a question in a way that sort of got spun into, oh, so you're acknowledging that there's a link between your game and CT, and they're like, yeah, but, and they never let them say the but because they were going to try to. So basically, I think they were dared into saying, like, you really don't believe it after 110 of 111 NFL players have had this, because that was around the time where people were still saying, like, you're getting biased cases. We don't know what the background population rate is, and we just published that we looked at all the Framingham heart study brains. So basically, this town of Framingham outside Boston, BU has been following for decades. Now they're all dying. They got 167 of their brains. They found 1 case of CT, and it was a college football player. Then we looked at 111 NFL players, 110. So if you can't understand that there's some, and we've repeated this over and over again. So basically, we proved causation, and so the NFL is sort of forced to acknowledge it. But the reality is, like, it's amazing how long these organizations can fight back. So the NFL is the only group, other than the Australian Football League, that's acknowledged cause and effect. Every other major sporting body will probably until their CEOs retire, their general counsels retire, not admit what is so blatantly obvious. And it's sort of shame, I mean, that, guys are out there giving their lives for these companies, and their companies won't acknowledge what's real to them. I mean, luckily, like WWE and AEW, like they acknowledge it, but
why do you think it is? You think they're worried about a class action lawsuit or something like that, maybe? Or
I think it's beyond that, because the NHL settled their class action lawsuit, years ago. I think it has a lot more to do with just capitalism, just this idea that like the NHL, I feel like the NHL is what we should talk about today. You're a Canadian, and it's the playoffs, and we just announced Bobby Hull had CTE. We just announced Chris Simon had CTE. Like we are literally at 20 of 21.
No kidding.
Yeah,
wow.
With more to come. Like a bunch of families have been so pissed off the NHL keeps denying it. They're now saying you can share my husband's findings. So like it's going to be bad. We can't find healthy brains of guys who played in the NHL. That doesn't mean they don't exist, but we're finding way too many. So but I think so they don't really have legal liability, but I wonder if they're selling the games off these big hits, right? Mm-hmm. And if people see those hits and their mind immediately goes to CTE, it's not as fun. Right. And so if they acknowledge this, they would have to change the game and change how they market the game. And they'd be worried that parents will no longer put their kids on that track, because if they realize sort of the prize of being successful in ice hockey and playing for 25 years is CTE, you might kill the sport.
It's unbelievable. I just Googled Chris Simon as we were talking, and I didn't even realize that he had passed away, one, and B, from stage 3 CTE after he committed suicide, which is unbelievable.
Yeah. I mean, it's very sad. The list is, it's the old guys, it's the young guys, it's the Stan Mikita, it's Derek Bugard. Like it's a lot of guys.
Well, you start going through like a guy like Bob Probert, who just went crazy towards the end of his life. I mean, he was a total fighter that could easily have had CTE.
Yeah. I mean, Probert's one of those cases who he had a very difficult life his whole life.
Sure.
But if you fight as much as Bob Probert does, like I think the odds are you'd have it. Again, we don't have a good sense of what the actual rate is. If it's not 95% of NHL players, that's what we've seen in our 21 brain. But hopefully it's much, much lower. But the reality is I'm starting to get worried that our sample is not so biased, that it's a good chunk of these pro athletes.
I mean, if the NFL and the NHL, accepted this, is there something they could do to help prevent it?
Yeah, that's the beautiful. Yes, that's the problem that frustrates me, and why I push so hard, is that this is entirely a preventable disease. Like this does not exist in the population, and so we also published a study a couple of years ago looking at 600 football players. We took every position they played every year of their career. We took modern sensor studies saying, well, how many times would they have gotten hit as an offensive lineman in high school, blah, blah. We extrapolated that out. And we showed that basically CT is a math problem. The more hits you took and the harder those hits are, the more likely you are to get it. And so what that means is that cut the hits out. And how would you do that in American football? Well, you would start later. Instead of starting tackle at 5, or you start at 14. You might save 3,000 hits that way.
Right.
And then when you're practicing, like when I was practicing college, we hit multiple days a week. Now, never hit in practice. Some people have shown you can do that and still succeed, but no. But college coaches are high school coaches are often very scared to change how they practice. Mm-hmm. So you don't hit in practice, you cut out another half of the hits. And so it's like all these small, and then after that, it's smaller changes, but get rid of kickoffs, helmets, all this other stuff. So with hockey, it would be, maybe you can't play 100 games in a year, hitting like you do today. Ken Dryden is always saying, well, the game would still be fine if every check to the head was illegal. It wasn't always about like, were they trying to or not? It was just like, you hit them in the head, it's a penalty. So if you just reduce the number of hits and the strength of the hits, you will reduce the risk of CTE. You will prevent cases. And then the other part of that, though, is if we acknowledge CTE and it exists, we might actually try to cure it. Right? Like nobody's trying to cure it. The NFL has been investing money in like helmets. They're not investing in how do we diagnose CTE and therefore how could we cure it? Because I don't think they want us to be able to diagnose CTE in life and realize that potentially half the guys in the field have it right now. Like that would make football hard to watch if you knew half the guys had it on the field today. but that might be the case.
It's the old proverb, when you're a wrestler, you have a bump card and you only have a certain amount of bumps. It's the same thing with what you're saying with NFL or hockey. You have so many hit cards or so many tackle cards or check cards.
Yeah, before you'll get CT. Exactly. And you don't know what your number is. Your number is influenced by your genes, all these other things. But that's a great point. You only get so many hits before it's over. And that's something that people need to realize. And the problem is, like, you're in wrestling, you're in charge of your hits, right? You can decide if someone's going to hit you in the head, but it's not the same way in sports. It comes down to the people who organize it. It comes down to the coaches, and they're not taking the risks. And that's why we're not seeing the change. If they were player coaches, it'd be a much different game at every level, in every sport, if they were carrying that same risk, but they're not.
So let's go to, you mentioned WWE and AEW right from the start has been, Chris Nowinski friendly. You've been coming in to give us, speeches and seminars and that sort of thing from the start. When did the WWE start turning around to being on your side as well?
I think it was 2012. Where they I mean, it was like, again, it's still a fascinating time where, like, we had been sort of fighting in the media for almost 5 years around the Benoit stuff. And then suddenly I've got getting a phone call. I got like a voicemail from Vince, and I just didn't believe it was Vince. I thought it was somebody faking it. Because everyone can do a good Vince, and but he called and tracked me down and at the office and said, come in, let's talk about this, and said, we have a new perspective on it. How can you help us? And so then they started funding the research. They had me start coming in annually to train folks about what we know about concussions and CT, so you guys have informed consent. And I mean, it is one of the only really positive stories about this is that they've stuck with it, and it's like, wrestling is just dramatically safer than it used to be. And because they're putting top down constraints on what can happen, because we all want to have be the star of the show, have the biggest bump, take the biggest risk. But if everybody does that, it gets out of control. People get hurt.
In 2012, what do you think made WWE have such a change in mindset?
I think you'd have to. I mean, I don't know for sure. It was discussed in the Netflix documentary about Vince that I think he might have said something just about the timing of it, that I was in the press saying things about. There were a few guys that died back then,
right?
That had there are a few guys who died back then that had sort of bothered me. So I hadn't really spoken out too much, but I said some things in the press that they didn't like, that got attention. And so that I think that's sort of what led to the sit down.
So what kind of rules and regulations have they put on that? Like, what's changed over the years that you've really noticed in wrestling to kind of cut down a lot of these dangers?
Yeah, well, I mean, you would know better than me, sort of the conversations that are happening back there, like, because the only thing the public really knows is like chair shots are banned to the head and all that in WWE, and then I guess in AEW there's different. It's extremely rare, and there's certain things that need to happen to let it be allowed. I would say a lot of it is driven by different risk management choices from the performers themselves, right? So you are now empowered to realize, like, I don't need to go off the top of that ladder through a table if there's another way I can get the same pop, and sort of think about risk reward in a more explicit sense, and thinking about brain health. I mean, I guess, if we think back, like right before I came into pro wrestling to the WWE was when The Rock hit Mick Foley with a chair 7 times while he's handcuffed on his knees. Like, that would never happen again, right?
Yeah.
So again, it's not just chair. Sort of all objects to the head don't happen anymore. Which is great in the WWE. And then everything else, I think, is just much more rare. So, like, when people do things that could be risky, I think it's far more thought out, right? There's stunt coordinators that are helping. There's pads might be in place that used to not be there. Like, I think people are thinking about this a lot more in terms of what could go wrong. And then there's doctors now ringside, whereas there used to not be, right? We just, when I was working, it was just an athletic trainer in the back. And now the doctor's ringside in real time with an earpiece so that they can talk to people.
I do remember, like, Chris, and this is how crazy it is with, especially with my generation, which is early 90s. You could see it in ECW. The kind of badge of honor was to take chair shots to the head, and you take them. You'd be like, and I just remember like this is just the way it is. And you think, how stupid is that to just take chair shots? And for people that don't, what are steel chairs made of? They're made of steel. They're chairs. Yeah. And you would take that and just grit your teeth, and that was kind of the badge of honor. And I mean, just so ridiculous when you know what we know now, but that was part of the culture even 25, 30 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I when I give a lecture, I show Bradshaw in a hardcore match taking a garbage can over the top of my head, where I'm not going to put my hands up and just the garbage can, like a real metal garbage can, and it touching both sides, collapsing completely. I'm like, what the hell was I thinking? But that was, I mean, you did
were just thinking what you were taught. That's just the way it was, So
cool.
When you put together, because I've been to, I think, all of your seminars, if that's what you call them, or talks in AEW, you put together a 5-10 minute video, and it's got a lot of kind of lowlights, shall we say. Talk about some of the examples that you use in your video, that you show the guys and girls of kind of some danger signs to look out for.
Yeah. So there have been, I've gotten permission from a lot of different people to use videos of injuries and mistakes to help sort of show both strategic choices that could have been made differently to prevent a brain injury, or what a brain injury looks like in the ring, so you know when to stop. Because I think one of the most complicated things in the world that only people in the industry appreciate is that when you're wrestling, selling is trying to look like you've just had a concussion. Right. You're staggering around. You're like, oh, I've been hit. And the difference between pretending you have a concussion, actually have a concussion, is up in the air, right? Like it's hard to tell. Like I used to, back when I used to call people, like text them in the back, are you okay? Like, you look like you're hurt. Like, I was selling you, idiot. And I was like, I stopped texting people because I couldn't tell as an observer, but so I'm trying to teach the guys, like, here's things that no one's faking, or here's something you should never fake, so that people know when you do this, like the fencing posture. When everyone started learning that, like, when you stick your arm straight up and you're look unconscious, that's a severe brain injury. People started doing that in wrestling matches, and like, no, stop that, because you want the doctor to know if he sees that to get in the ring and stop the match. So it's been, so we're just basically trying to teach about choices, and then try to talk about what to look for, so you know when to stop, because there's nothing more dangerous than putting somebody up in the air when they've had a concussion. And one of the highlights this year was that Goldberg and Undertaker had that big match in Saudi Arabia where Goldberg got concussed twice, and now they're very public about that experience. And so I show that because it's just like, if those two guys Undertaker couldn't recognize that Goldberg was hurt, like, you realize that you really have to be paying attention, and you really have to notice small things, ask questions, and err on the side of caution, or stop and pause and put the doctor in, rather than just trying to fight through it. Like, they'll figure it out. Their brain will come back. Like, all that stuff is like life and death choices. And so that's been great. I've also learned, though, like, it's one of the things we don't ever talk about, but I grew up in a football culture, where you'd watch the film of the game from the night before, on Sunday, and coach would rewind it and say, you see how you screwed up here, and just like hammer you. And it was just part of what I was used to. So I've learned, though, that some people haven't grown up like that. And so when I'd show people who were in the company, like, making mistakes, and, not casting blame, just like, here's an example. Like, I forgot how we all take pride in our work, and how hard it is to watch yourself make a mistake. And so I've stopped doing that. I've stopped showing any videos of people who are in the room.
Do you remember? I mean, obviously you do, the concussion that you got, that, because I know you had a year of post-concussion syndrome, but was there a certain bump that you took where this was the one that got you?
Yeah, it was, the one that got me was, look back, it's so dumb, but it was just a house show against the Dudleys, where literally, like, he threw Bubba into the corner. went in for a boot, which we'd done many times. But I just remember like this, we were at the Hartford Civic Center. No one was there. It was quiet as a mouse. And so we like, when we got tagged in, we're like moving with extra energy. And I just probably ran, 20% faster than I usually did, try to make it look better. And I was just way too close to his foot. And so like literally it felt like it took my head off. And that was the moment. But the problem was I had a headache, the next day still. And I was foggy, but I didn't tell anyone. Like I just was too scared to say, like, I don't feel good. Like I went into the training room to tell Chris Brandon, like, I think something's wrong. But then I just saw everybody else getting ready. I'm like, I can't do it. I can't tell them I have a headache. And so I just wrestled on and off for 5 weeks, just lying every time I felt bad until I developed a sleep disorder. But yeah.
I would say that one of the things that's changed in the wrestling culture is that there right alone, Chris, is people now, if you're having a headache or whatever it may be, you do go and ask about it and get it checked out, because the days of like, just grit your teeth and get through it, kid, those are long gone. Thank God, because back in when I started, you did not tell anyone you were hurt, and you were a pussy if you did. Now it's the other way around. You're an idiot if you don't say something, because none of this matters. It's just all work. Make sure we're all feeling good and are able to work the next day.
Yeah. You reminded me of two stories, both involving Tommy Dreamer. So I love Tommy, and he's been great. And he let me interview him for my book way back when, from all his concussions. But like, I remember once we were in like Laramie, Wyoming. And I remember I used to ice things, because that was, again, the football culture. After a match, you ice. And Tommy's like, you can't ice in front of the boys, like, you
how dare you?
And I'm like, you can't admit you're in pain. I'm like, really? All right. And then one of my last matches was with Tommy in a tag, and before the match I literally couldn't remember the finish. It just would not embed in my brain. And I told them, I said, look, I can't remember, so if I blank out there, just tell me what to do. And they're like, okay. Because none of us realized what could go wrong if I really didn't know what was going on.
Right.
So, now we know, like, if someone tells you they can't remember anything, like, don't go in the ring with them.
Yeah.
But it was a very different culture.
How about guys like, Bryan Danielson, Adam Copeland, Christian Cage, who have had these, career-ending brain injuries? I think for the most part, they're all concussion related. I could be wrong, but I think they are. And then they're able to, come back after 7-8 years. I think Adam's case was 9. What is it they're able to do to evade these symptoms and be able to come back to work?
Yeah. That's a great question. So what has changed dramatically is that when I got hurt in 2003, like, there wasn't concussion rehab, right? People didn't really know how to fix you. So if you had chronic headaches or you had chronic visual disturbances, you didn't have the eye exercises, the balance exercises, all these things that helped retrain your brain. And so now that's a big part of all concussion recovery, is that you get very active very fast. It's no longer sit in a dark room and wait till you get better. It's after 48 hours, get back to doing things and actually work on getting your brain to get better. And so I think rehab got better. And the thing with concussions is that because it's something we don't really understand, right? Like, if you think about it, 100 billion neurons in your brain, trillions of connections. For some hit causes some of that to get, ripped, torn apart. Like, tiny, some cells die, some connections get torn, but your brain works around it. And we can't image it, and we have no idea how bad it is. Basically, so your recovery is determined by, do you have any residual symptoms? Do you feel okay? Great. Are there any holes in your brain when we give you an MRI? No. Well, I guess you can go back if you're willing to take the risk. Like, that's sort of where we've gone to. And some people think that's good, because psychologically, this is like, that's what you love to do. That's your way of making a living. Why should we hold you back just in case? Because the other thing we found is that number of concussions does not predict who gets CTE. Because if you think about it, I took 10,000 hits to my head. 10 of them caused symptoms. The other 9,990, some of them were causing brain damage, and I didn't feel it. There's things called subclinical traumatic brain injuries. And so basically, when you feel symptoms is not the only time your brain's getting hurt. And when you feel symptoms doesn't mean it's the worst injury. So long story short, it's sort of a functional question. If you can go out there and perform safely once your symptoms are gone, people are getting cleared again. And I think from what we've seen with Adam and Christian, like it's okay. And Brian, like they're doing okay, right?
Yeah.
And so I mean, again, the CT risk is always there. You could, if you keep getting hit in the head, they're all wrestling, much safer styles than they probably were in the early 2000s. So maybe they're maybe not increasing the risk of CT at all, and they're preventing concussions. And I think they've shown that you can come back, which is why this is where I'm here to announce my comeback.
Nice. As we start to wind down, Chris, what is your day-to-day like as you are, running this foundation, or definitely the face of it? What are you kind of doing on a daily, weekly, monthly basis?
So so we have 20 employees now at the Concussion Legacy Foundation.
That's great.
We're all over the country. We're also in 3 other countries. We're in Canada, the UK, and Australia.
Amazing.
And I'm a member of the research team at BU. So my days are basically, we're doing 3 things. I'm involved in policy discussions and advocacy around making sports safer, campaigns like Stop Hitting Kids in the Head. I'm advancing research. So like today, I'm talking to drug companies about different ways we can test things. We're recruiting for a new study called Diagnose CTE2, which is a $15 million study funded by the National Institute of Health to BU, where CLF is recruiting hundreds of ex-football players to be part of this. So I'm working on that. And then we have our helpline, where we're constantly trying to figure out how do we support these people who are impacted. So, last night I'm on a phone call with an NFL player's wife, a guy that I grew up watching, his wife, like, how are we going to help him? And we're sort of navigating, all right, here's the doctor you're going to go see, here's the study you're going to be part of, and here's a support group you can join. So, basically, like, how do we prevent this? How do we cure this? And how do we take care of the people that are struggling now? That's my life.
I see on the little name thing, he says Chris Nowinski, PhD. Did you get your PhD after, or is this just something you put on there?
What? You think I'm faking it? This is not pro wrestling show. You do not lie about a PhD.
You don't fake a PhD.
No, that's outrageous. I went back to school part-time in 2010.
Gotcha.
So basically at BU, when you started the center, I had an office, and they're like, why don't you go take classes down the hall? I was like, it was intimidating at the time. But I was like, all right, fine. And so once I did, I was like, oh yeah, this is my future. So now I am a behavioral neuroscientist.
Wow.
And you will call me Dr. Nowinski from now on, since you didn't realize it. But yeah, I've had a PhD in behavioral neuroscience now for 8 years.
That's amazing.
And very proud of it.
I know, like, for 2 of my kids are type 1 diabetics, and the technology has increased even in the last 6 or 7 years since they were diagnosed. Has the technology to help concussion research, CTE, and treating it, curing it, advanced exponentially as well?
On the concussion front, it's getting much better. So there's lots of different ways to diagnose it now. So there's blood tests for concussion. Like it's exciting. CTE, there's just not enough people working on it right now. Like, so I feel like a little bit of like Johnny Appleseed on CT. Like, we started brain banks around the world. We've proved the first cases of CT in Australia, in New Zealand. Like, I'm trying to get their scientific communities working on this by proving it's in their country. Because we were just having this conversation with a drug company where they were like, how many people do you think in America are full-time working on CTE? They're asking an Alzheimer's researcher, and he goes, well, I work on CT more than anyone I know, and I'm half-time. Like, so there's zero people funded to only work on CTE, which is scary, because I think this disease is actually much, much bigger than you realize. And so that we just need to, we need to make CT an issue that we can, and we're doing it. I think that inflection point will come when we can diagnose it in living people, and people realize, oh, it's way more people than we realize. It's my dad, it's my brother, it's whatever it is. And then we get to work on trying to save them.
Last few things. So what's your overall goal with the CLF, as far as curing it completely, awareness, a combination?
Yeah, I think, I'll obviously the concussion front, it's going to be just constantly have to fight that battle, because we're always trying to backslide into like you saw in the Maple Leafs when they left their goalie in. After too obvious, look like too obvious concussions. You got to be vigilant on concussions, but big picture, like I'm happy when we've reformed sports, especially for kids, that we're not creating new cases of CTE. We should not be creating pediatric CTE, but we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
If adults want to get it because for a job, that's one thing, but no pediatric CTE, and then a cure. Yeah, I think it is a cure. Like we can, just like we need a cure for Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, like we absolutely need to talk about curing CTE. And what's special about it is we might have a better chance because it's environmentally caused. We can create it in a laboratory model, and you have a lifetime to treat it because this is the only brain disease that people are getting in their teens, right? And they're dying 50 years later, and we have 50 years to treat it. But I'm 46 now, so the clock's really ticking for me. You probably don't know this. We diagnosed my college roommate with it. So this is the Harvard football program from 1999. So that's me. And Chris Eitzman, who was our captain, drank himself to death 3 years ago. Oh my gosh. 4 years ago now. And he had stage 2 CTE. Oh. So, now we're diagnosing, we're studying another one of my teammates, Mike Brooks, who was our strong safety, who just died. So it's a ticking clock, man. It is.
It's amazing too, like being, on at the end of my career, but 34 years of doing this, you'd be like, I'll just take the hit and worry about it later. Like, who cares? How bad can it be? You are on the other side of the fence saying it can be pretty bad. Use your freaking noggin when it comes to your noggin.
Well said. And the new frame I'm trying to use is like, we all feel like we're indestructible. But like when we talk about like Benoit, and we just had another story about that. Look up, if you're listening, Corwin Brown in the Washington Post, who took his wife hostage at age 40, tried to kill himself. His kids were 9, 11, and 13 at the time, NFL player. And they're now adults in their 20s, and they've shared their story about how that's like having a dad who almost certainly has CT has impacted their lives. And like, people are rough on their kids when they have CTE.
Yeah.
And I think that's a frame that all of us as adult men need to realize, and tell the younger generation, like, you're not going to be the one who pays the price. You're going to drift off into, dementia. But your family will pay an enormous price if you get this disease.
Last question for you, Chris, going back to your wrestling days. I know your career was relatively short in the big picture, but do you have a favorite match that stands out for you as one that you remember?
Well, there are so few matches that it is not hard to remember, right? It's like I got my one last ride from The Undertaker, or I got, I had my moment in the Royal Rumble, and that until my head got smashed in 2003. But I guess, my most fun creatively was probably, wrestling my mentor from Tough Enough, Al Snow, when we had a hardcore match and I get to bust out a skeleton and start reciting Shakespeare on one knee while wearing a sport coat with elbow patches, and just the fun we used to have out there. So go enjoy that one on YouTube if you're watching.
Well, man, once again, congratulations on creating this entire movement in the sports field and sports medicine field. And looking forward to seeing what you can do in the future. And thanks for always coming to talk to us, especially the young guys and girls who may not realize just how serious these things can be if you don't remedy them and take care of them, especially during the match. It's okay to just stop the match.
It's okay.
It's okay. It's not a big deal. So.
Yeah, I love it. All right, Chris, pleasure to chat with you about this. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Chris.